All right, now let's take a peek into protocols. Now to get into the protocol side of things, some of the things we need to look into is the section of OSI model. And hopefully with previous courses you've taken and previous knowledge, you have an idea of what the OSI model is and the order of the layers and so forth. We're going to cover this here, but make sure that you know the order that it goes in. Other things we're going to be talking about here too are going to be TCP/IP, and we'll take a look at that. We're going to look at ICMP, your Internet Control Message Protocol, UDP, User Datagram Protocol, ARP, your Address Resolution Protocol, DNS, Domain Name Service, SSH, your Secure Shell, and your Simple Network Management Protocol, also known as SNMP, and SMTP, your Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. So let's take a peek at these, and again, make sure you know these. This important information as in what order the OSI model goes in and things like that, because that will assist you in answering questions correctly. Just to say, hey, what's between the application layer and the network layer, or something to that effect. All right, anyhow, here we go. Let's take a peek at the application layer, which is the top layer, also known as Layer 7. Now, Layer 7 is the application, as we already mentioned. This is where protocols are going to be allowed the applications to communicate to applications on the remote system. All right, now this is not where the applications work, but the protocols that support the application's networking functionality. Now, some of the protocols at this layer would be your Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, which also runs on port 25, HTTP, which runs on port 80, that's your Hypertext Transfer Protocol. We also have the Line Printer Daemon Protocol, or LPD. A lot of times you're going to see something like that, possibly something like 9100 as the port number, which is also your JetDirect. All right, the FTP, your File Transfer Protocol, which is going to be port 20 and 21. And you have Telnet, which runs at port 23, and TFTP, which runs at port 69, which is your Trivial File Transfer Protocol. Next up on the list is the presentation layer. And this is going again from the top down. And with the presentation layer, no protocols generally work at this layer, only services, and we're only concerned with the syntax of the data there. Data conversion into standardized formats such as GIF, ASCII, Unicode, JPEG, and TIFF are done at this layer, and also encryption, decryption, compression, and decompression are going to be at this layer. All right, so we have data conversion, and we have encryption, decryption, compression, and decompression happening at the presentation layer. Next up on the list is the session layer. Now, functionality here is the dialog management between the programs, which gives us access control, recovery, and synchronization. We have setup, maintenance, session teardown of sessions, communication channels, and so forth happening at this layer. Depending on the protocol at this layer, communication can take place either via full duplex, which means two-way conversation at the same time, or half duplex, which only one application can communicate at a time. And some of the protocols that work at this layer, we have SQL, NFS, and RPC, which we'll talk about here later as well. All right, then we have the transport layer. This is the end-to-end packet transfer using connection-oriented or connectionless protocols. Now, the transfer protocols are then concerned with getting the data from one system to the other. It does not work with application-to-application communication, however. Now, use the ports to communicate with higher-level protocols and then to track different communications taking place. We have segmenting or appropriate size of packets for processing by the network layer, and some of the protocols that work here are UDP, TCP, and SPX, which is going to be used for your Novell systems, at least back in the earlier days. But nowadays, we're pretty much only really using TCP and UDP. Now, the next up is the network layer. This is where your routing takes place. So the routing of the packets and addressing takes place here. Routing protocols generally will work at this layer. And when a packet is sent down from the transport layer, the network layer protocol then allows and adds the address to create a network header. Confidentiality, authentication, and integrity can also be provided at this layer. This, however, is done through the use of IPsec, your Internet Protocol Security, and then some of the protocols that work at this layer. Again, these are going to be some of your routing protocols here, which is IP, your RIP, ICMP, IGMP for your Internet Group Management Protocol, IGRP, and BGP. The data link layer. Well, we're working our way down, aren't we? Now, data link layer, the sender breaks data into frames, then transmits sequentially the format frame for proper technologies such as token ring, Ethernet, and ATM, as in your asynchronous transfer mode. Referred to as framing, we have the media access, which is token passing via the CSMA, which hopefully you've heard of this before, your carrier sense multiple access, and then we have collision detection and collision avoidance along with that, depending on what we're using, if it's Ethernet or token ring networks type of scenario. We have polling that goes on here, which also takes place at this layer. Synchronization and error control also happens here, and it also has two sublayers. This is the logic link control layer as an LLC, and the MAC, your media access control layer. Not to be confused with the MAC address, which is your physical address of your network card. This is media access control, again, a sublayer of the data link layer. All right, we also have your WLAN, your wireless LAN, and your token ring as well. So 802.11, 802.5, and such. So as you can see there, how it's kind of broken down. And there you go. Now, also I wanted to mention, this is also the layer where ARP cache poisoning and DNS poisoning and spoofing occurs. Okay, so that might be something pertinent to remember. Then we have the physical layer. Now, the physical layer, the functionality here turns bits into voltage. The encoding of voltage binary representation varies between your LAN, MAN, and WAN, as in your local area, your metropolitan area, and your wide area networks technologies. Right? That provides standards for interfaces to media, types of electrical signals, and formats depending upon the transmission type. We can do photons for fiber, for instance, electrical voltage for Ethernet, and so forth. Right? The radio frequencies for wireless as well. There it is, your 7 layers. All right, so when it comes down to the TCP/IP suite, interestingly enough, you need to obviously know that TCP/IP is a transmission control protocol, internet protocol. Here we're specifically talking about IPv4, as in version 4. We also have IPv6, and IPv6 is going to be running a little bit differently, but here let's concentrate on IPv4 at least for now. Right? We have TCP, which is Connection-Oriented Transport Layer Protocol, meaning that it has to have a session established before it can transfer data from one computer to the next. All right, we're going to take a look at the information that's within the TCP/IP suite. All right, we'll look at IP, Connectionless Network Layer Protocol. It's basically responsible for kind of getting you to the destination. The suite of protocols that govern how it travels over the network, and again here you can see kind of the TCP header. Got the source port, destination port, a 32-bit sequence number, which will be important later on when we talk about hijacking, such as session hijacking and TCP/IP hijacking and so forth. It comes all down to knowing what the next sequence number is and things. All right, we also have a 32-bit acknowledgement number. We have a header length. We have some reserve there. We have then this urge, act, push, reset, SYN, and FIN, which we'll talk about in detail here in just a moment, because you will need to know the differences between them and when they're used. All right, we also have a window size. We have a TCP checksum, also known as the CRC, the cyclic redundancy check. And then we also have a 16-bit urgent pointer and any other options, and then, of course, the data within. All right, so let's take a peek at some of this. Before we dive into that, we're going to look at port and protocol relationships. And again, as I mentioned before, knowing port numbers and their relationship to what service they're running will definitely assist you in getting the right information and getting the answers correctly for simple questions like, what port does FTP run on? Or what port does SNMP run on? And you should be able to identify those for some easy answers just by knowing and memorizing some of the port numbers. Okay, so when we're looking into knowing port numbers and so forth, there's going to be a few you need to remember and memorize, because again, this will just assist you with answering some of those questions correctly. Now, port numbers are going to be mapped to specific protocols generally, and these are well-known ports. They're anywhere from 0 to 1023. Now, we have things like your file transfer protocol, which is used to copy files, move files, and so forth, which, again, we'll get into a little bit greater detail here in a few moments as well. All right, anyway, we use this port 2021. SMTP, your Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, runs on port 25. Now, some dangers there with port 25 is that we can use that mail server as a mail relay. And that basically allows us to send out, if we wanted to, thousands or tens of thousands of emails unsolicited using your mail server. So the dangers there with having port 25 open is that someone can use it as a mail relay and spam the heck out of you. Now the SNMP, your Simple Network Management Protocol, which runs on port 161, it is responsible for allowing us to actually connect into a remote device and manage it and so forth, very similar to Telnet. And a lot of times you're going to see it with printers, as in when printers get set up and so forth. Now the dangers there with SNMP, as we'll mention again, is going to be that you can expose a lot of information unwillingly, mainly because everything in SNMP is transferred over in clear text, unless you're using version 3. So version 1 and 2 is clear text, version 3 is encrypted. So we'll mention that again here shortly. Now HTTP obviously is going to be a clear text, and it's going to be used for web browsing. We have our counterpart, which is HTTPS, which is your Hypertext Transfer Protocol over SSL. It runs on port 443 and is also very important to remember. Now Telnet, again, allows us to connect to a router or whatnot using port 23. It is insecure because it is in clear text, and again, you need to watch out for that. Now, of course, to protect all these services and protocols have been used, we use something like IPsec to encrypt everything over the network. Okay, anyways, the source port is usually a high dynamic number, while the destination port is usually under 1024. Now, when we say high dynamic number, we're basically talking about like a 49,000 number. So let's see if I can show you guys what I'm talking about here. So if I do use a tool called NetStat, for instance, and use something like netstat -an, you'll notice here it's going to show me port numbers, right? And it tells me what's established and what's listening and so forth. So here it tells us on our 127, and then also gives me the port numbers. So you can see here we have the 49,000, right, 26,000 and so forth. We have 52,000 and so forth. So you can see here, this is what they're talking about, those high dynamic ports. It usually will start off in the 49,000 range and then work its way up. Now you notice here I have port 80, port 135, 443, 445, and so forth, 3389, which is actually for remote desktop, 5900, which is actually for VNC, and so forth. So you should be able to identify some of these ports just by looking at them and say, oh yeah, the 445, that's SMB over TCP/IP. And if I see port 135 and 445, or 139 even in 445 and so forth open, that means I can do a null session. Like see here, we have a 139 available and things. So we should be able to identify what ports are running, because the port numbers are going to be very, very important in regards to what's running, and we should be able to identify that. So anyways, so that's some of that, and that's what they're talking about with those high dynamic numbers and so forth. All right. Now TCP and UDP uses ports to communicate with upper layer protocols. So again, the conceptual use of ports is, as you can see here, we have TCP and the UDP side. Depending on the type of protocol you're using, type of service you're using, then it will use the appropriate UDP or TCP ports. Because on the TCP side, we have 65,535 ports, but we also have 65,535 ports on the UDP side as well. And some services will use both UDP and TCP. For instance, DNS will use UDP and TCP port 53, which is for your domain name service, as in this allows us to possibly do zone transfers and things as such, and things like that. So again, knowing those port numbers will definitely assist you in answering certain questions correctly. All right, so let's take a peek at UDP versus TCP real quick. Now TCP is going to be connection oriented, meaning that it has to complete the three-way handshake for it to start transferring data. And the three-way handshake is very simple. It's the SYN, SYN-ACK, and ACK. And we'll talk about the flags here in just a moment as well. But that's basically your synchronized flag going out to initiate the connection. It sends back a synchronized acknowledgement stating that it got the sync packet. And then it completes the three-way handshake, what we refer to as the three-way handshake, with an acknowledgement. And then once that happens, it can then start sending data back and forth. Now, there's also something else involved. It's called the TCP/IP sliding windows concept, and basically it means that whenever it sends data, it has to reply back stating that it got the data, so it can then send more and so forth. And that's what we mean by connection-oriented. It is also very, very reliable, and it performs a setup handshake. Again, error detection and correction is also there, and this is where they also mention the windowing. Again, I mentioned this as the sliding windows concept. And every server and workstation has this and so forth. So anytime you're connecting to a Windows machine, it's definitely going to go through that process. And again, what it does, with the windowing, it only allows certain amount of information in, and then as it receives it, it then opens it up again for more information to be able to come in. But again, it's guaranteed delivery. Now with UDP, User Datagram Protocol, this is connectionless, all right, meaning that it doesn't have to have the three-way handshake completed to be able to send data. So it doesn't have to have that connection before it can send the data. It just sends the data. With that, it is unfortunately unreliable. So no handshakes being performed, and it uses the best effort protocol. It just sends it out there and says, well, if it gets there, great. If it doesn't, oh well. Because there's no confirming that it received the data as it is with TCP, where it comes back and says, hey, I received packets 2, 3, 4. And then it slides on over and says, okay, now give me packets 11, 12, 13, and things like that. So it kind of goes back and forth. Connectionless is very fast, however, it's not reliable. So a lot of times UDP would be used for streaming, so it's streaming video and so forth. So usually the example I give here, let's say you're looking at a YouTube video, for instance, or something like that. And you're noticing that when the video moves and it blacks out but continues to move, and you maybe miss a couple of seconds or whatnot, that would be something like UDP. Whereas in TCP would be, okay, you get to a section, then it stops, it buffers, and then continues right where it left off. So it doesn't just continue on, right? And that would be more like TCP, where it's waiting, so there's guaranteed delivery, and you're not going to miss anything. UDP, again, just sends it out. It doesn't provide you that guaranteed delivery because it's not expecting, or it's not saying, hey, I received this, send me more. All right, let's take a peek at ARP, your Address Resolution Protocol. Now, ARP is very important. You need to know this. You need to know that it maps the IP address to the MAC address, as in your physical address of your network card. Now, an IP address, also should know, is a 32-bit software-assigned address. And again, with the 32 bits, we're talking about IPv4, okay, when it comes to IP address. So this is a decimal format, and it's 32 bits on the binary side. So we are able to do different things with that. Again, we'll talk more about that later as well. All right, it is, of course, here at the network layer, and we have the MAC address, which is, again, the physical address, or it's 48-bit hardwired into the network interface card. It is going to be at the data link layer, as in ARP is going to be running at the data link layer. All right, and the IP address itself, as you notice there, is going to be at the network layer. All right, anyways, so we have data link layer protocols. You need to understand MAC addresses, not IP addresses, okay? Meaning that ARP only understands the MAC address information. It just kind of maps the MAC to the IP. That's really all ARP really does, the Address Resolution Protocol. Now we also have what's called RARP, which is your Reverse Address Resolution Protocol, and it maps the MAC address to the IP address. So IP to MAC and MAC to IP, all right? That's how that all kind of comes into play. Now keep in mind, with ARP, let me show you here real quick. With, let's say if I use ARP and I do a ARP -A, that shows me my ARP cache. So you can see here, this is all my information regarding my IP address, the MAC address, right? And ARP keeps track of that. Now, what I can do is I can type in something like ARP -D that will delete my ARP cache. And now if I do an ARP -A again, you'll notice here I have no ARP entries, which is great, because that means I don't have any entries right now. So whenever a machine goes out there and says, hey, what IP address is this? All the machines in the network will basically pick that up, put it in ARP cache, and say, okay, so-and-so MAC address is this IP address. And so as the entries go through the network, everybody picks it up, and then the one that has it responds, and then everybody puts it in their ARP cache. And that's how you end up with a lot of entries in your ARP cache. Now, the interesting thing with ARP cache is that it can be poisoned for an attack known as the man-in-the-middle attack. For that to be successful, we need to do some ARP cache poisoning. And then once we do ARP cache poisoning, we also have the ability to do DNS cache poisoning, which means on the DNS side, which maps the host name, or your fully qualified domain name, such as www.google.com, to an IP address. And we can also manipulate that as well with a different attack called DNS spoofing or DNS cache poisoning. And again, this is all part of the man-in-the-middle attack type scenarios. So ARP is definitely very important, and we need to keep track of that. Now, another way where ARP comes into play is going to be with switches, and not necessarily ARP, but more the relationship between MAC address and port numbers. So when it comes to a switch, for instance, we also get into things where it keeps track. A switch will keep track of the IP address to what port number, and of course the MAC address information as well. So we have MAC IP address information and then on what port. So that way it keeps track of the information coming in through a specific port number. Now, I mentioned here a few moments ago the CSMA, your carrier sense multiple access, and then we have collision detection. Now, collision detection generally is going to be in a hubbed environment where you have data just getting sent out onto the network. There's a lot of collisions that happen, and on your hub, for instance, you'll see a lot of red lights or orange lights or yellow lights, and those basically indicate collisions on the network. Now, with a switch, we basically are putting in what we call the carrier sense multiple access collision avoidance, and basically what it does, it keeps track of what information is coming through what port, as in what client it's coming from and so forth, and it's able to control the traffic so there's not a collisions happening on the network. So it's kind of like a traffic cop in a sense. It keeps track of all the data going through and so forth. When it comes to a switch, we basically have the ability to override that switch and make it act like a hub. And the way we do that is we force MAC address to IP pairings to the switch. The switch has what's called a CAM table, content address memory table, and it basically keeps track of your MAC address to IP address to where the port, what port it's on. And that can be manipulated by a tool called MACOF, M-A-C-O-F, and it basically floods the switch with literally thousands and thousands of entries for MAC to IP pairings, so that the switch can then basically come back and be overwhelmed and cause that CAM table to fill up, which then allows that switch to act like a hub, which allows us to then see everything on the network instead of just the section that we're connected to. Now, in the terminology that we've used before when it comes to reconnaissance and so forth, it's definitely one way to go to get additional information about the network. As we'll talk later about sniffing, this would be considered active sniffing whenever we're connected to a network with a switch involved. It's always considered active sniffing. All right, and we'll talk more about that in the sniffing module here later on. All right, so anyhow, that's where all that kind of comes in. I'm going to repeat some of that again because it is very important to remember the differences between that, but there you have it. All right, let's take a peek at ICMP. Now, your Internet Message Control Protocol basically allows you to have status and error messaging protocol. That's not used to move user data. However, you have the ability to actually move data inside of it, which is a different type of attack that we can use. But for that, you probably want to check out some of the ICMP RFCs, your request for comments for that. Another place to go to real quickly too for your scenarios here. Let me give you guys a scenario here. What you can do is go to protocols, protocols.com, for instance, and from here, look up TCP/IP. So you look up TCP/IP, and then from here, you can look up ICMP. And as you can see here, it's running RFCs, your request for comments, 792 and 950 that you can check out. But here's what's really important is this type and this code, because you will need to know certain type and codes for ICMP. And what I would recommend is that you go through and memorize a few of these, because you never know what may come up when it comes to that. But as it's mentioned here in the slide, is it does give us status error messaging, and we need to pay attention to that, as in what type and code it comes up with, so we can then identify what's happening. All right, the ping utility uses this protocol. Right, so when you do a ping to a specific IP address or a name, obviously it's going to come back, and ICMP requests are sent, and ICMP replies are also sent. as well. Now, the way ICMP is used by hackers, although it's allowed through most firewalls, it's used for host enumeration. It can redirect traffic by sending bogus ICMP messages to the router. The router then thinks that another router is telling it that a link is down or congested. And as I mentioned before, you do have the ability using other tools like HPing, Hyperping, to actually take, for instance, an Excel spreadsheet and dissect it into the ICMP requests that are going out when you do the ping and so forth. But we won't talk about that right now too much. Maybe we'll mention it later on, but just know there are definitely some possibilities there. Pretty cool stuff. All right, let's take a peek at your network services. And this is going to be your DNS server, right? Domain name service server. And it works in a hierarchical naming structure. We have host name to IP address mapping. Again, this is going to be your name to IP mapping. And the DNS server that holds the resource records for a zone is called the authoritative DNS server for that zone. And overall, when we talk about zone transfers, it's a pretty simple concept. Basically, what we're doing is we have multiple DNS servers. And we can do what's called a zone transfer from one DNS server to another or to a client machine that's requesting it. And it just gives us additional information. I'll show you guys some tools here that will allow us to do some zone transfers. One is called DNS enum, and the other one is called NSLOOKUP. Now, we can also use another tool, which is in the Unix-specific world called DIG. And it allows us also to enumerate some of the DNS servers out there. Now, for this to work properly, we need to have port 53 open. And so forth with that. All right, so keep that in mind. Port 53 DNS allows us to do zone transfers, and we'll take a peek into NSLOOKUP and then mention DIG, and again use a tool called DNS enum that can be found in Backtrack in Kali as well, that you can then check out to do some DNS zone transferring with. Pretty cool. All right, then we have SNMP, your simple network management protocol. It basically runs off what's called a master and agent model. The agents gather status information about network devices, and the master polls the agent and provides an overall view of the network status. Now, we have community strings. These are going to be default strings that we use, one called public and one called private. And so best thing there to do is to change that into something else. Public is for read-only, and private is for read and modify of your MIB data that can be used to modify it, depending on what community string you use. Now, there's tools out there, so one called Look at LAN, for instance, that will allow us to go in. We'll take a peek at that. You can see what information can be extracted from that. Now, there is also other information that can be used for SNMP data. There's one called SNMP check, also known as the SNMP enumerator. And it basically will also go out there and enumerate information from SNMP. Now, it runs off port 161 and 162, but anytime you see it, it's going to be running off of 161. Now, 162 is what's called the SNMP trap, but that runs off of 162. But the main one we need to remember is 161. All right, now, when it comes down to SNMP, again, lots of information that can be leaked. Remember, version 3 is what should be used if you're trying to protect the data, because it will encrypt the information. Versus version 1 and version 2, which provides it in clear text. SMTP, your simple mail transfer protocol. Transfers mail between different mail servers. SMTP is used to push information out, as in sending information. So a protocol sends outgoing mail from email clients, versus POP3, which is going to be used for receiving emails. Right? And then we also have IMAP. Now, SMTP runs on port 25. POP3 runs on port 110, and IMAP runs on port 143. All right, anyhow, we have security issues with mail servers, such as they're improperly configured as mail relay servers, which allows us, again, to send out unsolicited emails using your mail server. The server is identified and used by spammers, and companies get blacklisted by other companies without knowing why. Well, it's because they have port 25 open, right? And they have their server configured as a mail relay server. So that means that we can use it and abuse it and so forth. So no SMTP. We could also, for instance, with SMTP, if port 25 is open, we can telnet into it. We can telnet into that server with port 25, and then we could construct an email message from the command prompt and then also send that out unsolicited. Pretty cool stuff. Now we've talked about some of the different port numbers and so forth. We will be mentioning more port numbers that you're going to need to know, and we'll cover a few of the different protocols and services we just talked about. And here we're going to identify more so of those in the scanning live systems. Now here we're going to spend a little bit more time on, because you're going to need to know a lot of information regarding some of the tools that we're going to be using, especially a tool called Nmap, your network mapper. And my suggestion would be is to, one, pay attention obviously what we're talking about here. Secondly is to look into using the Nmap tool yourself to see what some of the different scenarios are, what the output looks like, and things like that. All right, so here we go. You guys ready for this? Let's make it happen. All right, so here we get into introduction to port scanning. Now, scanning is a method for discovering exploitable communication channels. Port scanning here is how attackers identify open and available TCP/IP ports, services, and applications on a system. Did you know, just because we know the port number, we can identify what service is running, and depending on the type of switch we use with a particular program, we can also identify what version it's running. That's pretty awesome. So when it comes down to application services on the systems that are associated with well-known port numbers, again here the example we're giving is port 80 for HTTP, port 23 for Telnet, and port 25 for SMTP, which you should know these by heart already. If not, make sure you memorize them. So when we figure out what services run which ports, well, you can actually go online and check out the INA.org assignments port numbers, and it shows a list of well-known and registered port numbers. This is also the main references for port numbers as well. You can also check out a list of Trojans which run on certain ports by going to glocksoft.com/trojan_port.htm, and you can go to neohapsys.com, neolabs, neoports, neoports.html, and this site lists a combination of the two, both well-known and registered and Trojan port numbers as well. So again, it is important to know port numbers. Now again, you don't need to remember 1,023 port numbers, but you will need to know a few, at least a dozen or two, to be able to identify quickly what it's running, and then with that, be able to answer certain questions correctly because you knew the correct port numbers. Okay, so some of the port scan tips: you should understand the three-way handshake. So as long as the three-way handshake has not been completed, the law generally hasn't been broken. Now, anytime we talk about not completing the three-way handshake, we can also identify it as a stealth scan or a SYN scan. And we'll talk more about those here in a little bit. All right, a port scan is also like checking to see if the door is unlocked, but not entering to see whether someone's at home. So no crime generally has been committed yet, so in most cases the police can't do anything at this point. So if a computer system is attacked many times by a port scan, one could possibly argue that the port scan was in fact a denial of service attack, which is usually an offense. So be very careful here. Laws differ in the different states and countries, so check with your legal department to make sure all is good to go. Now, as with anything else, of course, make sure if you're doing any type of scan like this that you have permission in writing to do so. Okay, port scans should reveal if a system is active and responsive, and of course what ports are open, closed, or even filtered. Now, what services are running and what information can be gleaned? We can figure out services and versions of those as well, which could then identify particularly like what version of Exchange it might be running, or what version of IIS you might be running, and things like that, which then tells us what the operating system and possibly the patch level that's running. A lot of times we can figure that out through the SNMP, your Simple Network Management Protocol. Port 161 can give us that information, again, using specific tools. And we can, of course, kind of get together a network blueprint overall and figure out what they have on the network. So some popular port scanning tools. Again, here's a tool called Look at LAN, which allows us to do some really cool things. So we're actually going to show you these, and you get a little preview of what they look like and how they work. Again, if you have the opportunity, try them out, see what you think. Otherwise, just take my word for it, and as you're watching the video demos there, and see what you can do there. But Look at LAN is definitely a nice little tool used for, very popular for the SNMP enumeration. We have SuperScan, which can be used both for scanning as well as enumeration. We have Unicorn Scan. We have Nmap, which we'll be spending a little time on. We have another tool called AutoScan, and HPing2, and HPing 3, which obviously you most likely will use the later versions of that. But again, very, very interesting and cool tools that you can use for that. All right, so check out some of these and take some notes. Okay, so hopefully you had an opportunity to check out the demo videos on each of these tools. Again, some are going to be more important than others, but at least now you have an idea of what the tools can be used for and how they can be utilized. When we're looking at ping, right, is the host online, we basically look at some basic network connectivity that can be tested using the ping command to determine the range of IP addresses mapped to the live host. Now, as was mentioned in the particular HPing demo, is at the end, sometimes you don't get a ping back. Because generally when you get a ping and you get a reply, it tells you that the host is online, meaning that the host is alive and it's out there. But however, as we saw with the HPing demo, there towards the end, we can also identify a online machine, even though it's not replying to ICMP requests. We can still get some data from it, or at least identify it as being online. And that's generally something you want to do a lot of times with your firewalls and routers and so forth, is you maybe don't want to have them reply to a ICMP request, right, as in a ping request. And because once we identify it, we can then check out what ports are open and so forth. So sometimes, and as we'll mention here in some of the Nmap switches, we can actually still do a port scan on a system that doesn't come back to a ping, but we can do other scans to it and still get some information in regards to what ports are open. Right, so again here, the ping sends out ICMP echo request packets, and if the address is live, an ICMP echo reply message will be received from an active machine. Alternatively, you can have TCP and UDP packets, which can also be sent if your ICMP messages are blocked. Pretty cool stuff. So we have what's called stealth online ping, which basically allows us to ping another machine from another IP address. So here we're basically doing it from the centralops.net site, which allows us to basically go out there and ping another machine. And what then happens is as the machine that we're pinging comes back and identifies us as where we're pinging from, it actually is going to pick up the IP address of centralops.net and not our IP address that we used to ping from. So in general, we refer to that as a stealth online ping. Okay, now here we have the three-way handshake. Very important to know the order that it goes in. We have what's called the synchronized packet. And again, we'll talk about the different flags that we use when we're going out there and doing our thing. Now, with the synchronized packet, it's generally going to be the initialized packet that comes out. It sends a client sequence number along with it. It's to the server. The server responds, in this case, or it might be another machine, responds with a SYN server sequence number and an acknowledgement, and then it finishes it up, the three-way handshake, with the acknowledgement. So TCP connections begin with your system sending a SYN packet to the server. The SYN server responds with a SYN-ACK, and then your system responds with an acknowledgement, and the connection is established. Again, know the order of the three-way handshake. Okay, let's take a peek at the TCP flags. Now, you will need to know these flags. You should be able to identify these in different types of output that you may be seeing from different tools. So a lot of times, again, you're just going to see the first letter of each of these flags, and should be able to identify those from there. You also need to be able to look at other information that has to do with the flags. The questions will be pretty straightforward when it comes to that, but a lot of times they're going to be in decimal representations or hexadecimal representations, and you need to be able to identify those and then also calculate the correct value if certain flags are being used and so forth. The questions that may come across on that will be pretty straightforward. They're going to give you the numbers, and then you just figure out what flags are used and then count the numbers together. All right, so we have, again, the synchronized flag, which is synchronizes the sequence number. All right, so it has an initial sequence SYN that goes out, and voila, you get that. Now, anytime we get a SYN out, it generally comes back with a SYN acknowledgement. And here the acknowledgement has an acknowledgement of the sequence number. We have what's called a final flag, or a FIN flag, and this is the final data bit, which is used during the 4-step teardown sequence. Now, what we have there with the FIN is basically we're breaking down the connection, but we're doing so gently. Another example would be something like, let's say you had a phone call and you called someone and you wanted to hang up. And what happens is you would say, hey, okay, it's time to go. I'll talk to you later. Bye. right? You know that it's coming. It's basically we're doing a soft hang up, and that's where the final bit flag or the fin flag comes in. Now we have what's called the reset or the RST flag. Now the reset bit's used to close the connection without going through the 4-step teardown sequence. So that means we're doing this abruptly. All right, so go back to the phone scenario I was just doing. So when you're on the phone with someone and you're, let's say you just hang up without saying goodbye or anything else, or the connection just gets dropped, that would be a reset. All right, so know the differences between a fin and a reset. One's used when the other one's used. And you should be able to identify those when it comes to looking at output and so forth. Obviously, it's going to be somewhat easily identifiable, F for fin and R for reset, and so forth. Anyhow, so fin and reset, know the difference between the two. And you need to know the difference between push and urge. Now, push data bits are used to signify that the data in the packet should be put at the beginning of the queue of data to be processed. So basically, any data that's going through the buffer would then be sent out. So we're pushing what's in the buffer out, basically. Now the urgent flag, here the urgent data bit is used to signify that there's urgent control characters in the packet that need to be processed immediately. So here we're actually sending it out immediately, not what's in the buffer, we're just sending it straight out. Scenario there might be something like the printer. A lot of times when you print to the printer, it prints to the print spool, and then it prints to the printer, but you do have the ability to print to the printer directly, and that's maybe the difference between your push and your urge. All right, and know the differences thereof and how that all works out, and take it from there. All right, okay, now let's take a look at some of the scans. Now again, we mentioned this thing called Nmap. It's a network mapper, and it allows us to do some really cool things. Now some important things about this is that you need to get some idea of how to use Nmap and how the results are coming back and forth and so forth from that. So let's start off first of all with the TCP Connect port scan. Now with the TCP Connect port scan, the attacker sends a SYN packet to sequential port numbers on the target to see which port numbers reply. Connection is tried to port 1, port 2, port 3, and so forth. Now keep in mind they may not be in that order necessarily, but they will do at least the first 1,023 ports. All right, now an open port will reply with a SYN-ACK, and a closed port will reply with a reset acknowledgement or no reply if it's filtered. And if it's filtered, it basically means there's a stateful firewall blocking it. All right, and that's where that means. So know what the TCP Connect port scan looks like, know what the open response is, and what the closed response is for a closed port. And again, sometimes it may be as simple as just knowing little bits of information to get you through some of the tough questions. All right, and with the way we're doing this here, you should be able to answer any of the questions that have to do with Nmap with what you're seeing here on the videos and so forth, okay? So again, if you have the opportunity, please try it out and give it a shot and see what you get with your results in regards to what it looks like and things like that, all right? Now we have what's called a SYN scan or a half-open scan. Okay, this is called a half-open. And basically, as you can see, it's a half-open because it doesn't complete the three-way handshake. Right? An open port will still reply with a SYN-ACK, and a closed port will reply with a reset acknowledgement. The advantage over TCP Connect scan is that it may not be detected by your simple intrusion detection systems, and no law generally has been broken at this time. All right, so you can see here, open port response. We have a SYN-ACK. Rather than completing the three-way handshake, it sends a reset flag back. On a closed port, we get an immediate reset acknowledgement back. Okay, this is called a half-open scan, also known as a SYN scan. Could also be known as a stealth scan. Now, the one previous with the TCP scan is also known as the vanilla scan, and also could be considered a Connect scan. All right, here again, as we mentioned, the firewall ports, a TCP Connect half-open scan should receive either a SYN acknowledgement or a reset acknowledgement packet. However, a third possibility exists, which would be no response. This is often due to the firewall port being filtered or possibly the packets being lost due to network congestion. Most likely not, but anyhow. So, but here we're basically saying when it comes back filtered, it means that there's a firewall blocking it. Right? In this case, firewall port response. So here again we see the Nmap TCP Connect scan. Right? It's also known as the TCP Connect scan, which we saw here a couple of slides ago. And again, what you need to do here, we see a screenshot of the ZenMap, which is basically Nmap's GUI version. And then from here, you pretty much can check boxes and things like that to get what you need rather than typing it in all from scratch and so forth. What we can do here too is let's say you wanted to do adjacent subnets, for instance, and so forth, right? Generally what you would do is you put in the target IP of, let's say, 192.168.2.0 with a /24, which is your CIDR notation of 24. That means scan the entire Class C subnet of 192.168.2, right, with a default subnet mask of 255.255.250. So it means the Class C will scan then all 254 IPs. Now, what we could do if you had, for instance, the 192.168.2, and you wanted to maybe get 5 different subnets, the way you would put that in is something like Nmap with the 192.168.2-6, for instance, right? That would take you from the .2 to the .3, .4, and .5, and it will give you those subnets that you can then run from there. Okay, and that's how you would actually run it if you wanted to do adjacent Class C in this particular case, since we're using a 192 Class C address. All right, so those are some of the things, again, you need to kind of look into and so forth along with that. Now, other things we need to get into. Again, we'll see a few of these in action as well with using Nmap. And actually, let me see if I can pop something up here for you. So here, let's hop into Kali real quick. And let's go ahead and try some of this out. I'm going to do an ifconfig to see what I'm actually on here. ifconfig always helps. All right, so I'm on the .40 network. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run Nmap. I can just run Nmap with defaults 192.168.40.0 with a /24. Right, this is the CIDR notation of 24. So that means it's going to go out there and actually do an Nmap scan on the Class C subnet of 40, right? So the 40 subnet of 255.255.250 on our Class C there. And we should be getting some results back here in just a moment. Now, some of the things, again, if you have the opportunity to try it out, make sure you have at least one other target out there on your same network. If you're using Kali or if you're using your Backtrack or whatnot. You can see here 4 hosts are up and running. Took about 30 seconds almost to complete. And as you can see, it went to 356 addresses, which includes the 255 and the 0. But here we can see we have report for 40-20, which has 58 and 5900, which is basically VNC and VNC over HTTP. Okay. Now we have some other ones here. This is 40-24. You can see here we have everything from 723, which is pretty popular, 53, 80, 135, 39, 445. Indicates that we can do a null session to it, which also tells us it's the Windows box. Now, what else we have here that may be pertinent? Again, it's 58, 5900 for VNC, and then these are some of the dynamic numbers that we see here. But nothing really else besides Telnet that could give us away, and then of course DNS 53 and such. Now let's take a peek up here. This is 40-23 of the results. See here, 135, 139, 445, so it's also a Windows box. It also has 3389. Now 3389 is very important because this is a remote desktop protocol. So this is RDP, and it basically tells us we can use RDP to connect to it, remote desktop. Very good. Let's see what else we got. We have a DAT22. Here we have FTP on this one, SSH, Telnet, SMTP, domain name, right? Pretty cool. So we have a lot of cool things here. So what we're going to do then is I'm going to use the 22 as our next target specifically. So what I want to do this time is I want to figure out some things. So what you can do is you can put in something like Nmap, and I'm going to use a -O option, uppercase O. And what this is going to do, it's going to go out there and give us an operating system information regarding that particular target. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. O for operating system. Okay. Let's take a peek here, and it will try to identify it and then give us results back into what it thinks it is. Okay, and as you can see here, it's telling us that the OS, in this case, since it's running a whole bunch of stuff, it's telling us here that it actually is VMware, obviously, but it's telling us it's running Linux 2.6x. And there it is. It's giving us the details here. So almost fooled me as a Microsoft basis because it's running 445 and 139, which a lot of times gives us away. However, you can see here 514, which is also important to remember. This is actually going to be the port number for syslog, and that's going to be Unix based. You can see here X11, that's also Unix. At 6,000, but not important to know for exam purposes. Okay, anyway, 514 is important to know. That's for, again, known as the syslog. All right, and of course some of the other ones here, 53, 25, 23, 22. Those are all important ones to remember when it comes down to that. All right, now what this basically means on this Linux box is that it's basically using some of the shared services that Microsoft also has. Whenever you share out a particular folder in Microsoft, it will open up those ports. So when you do file and printer sharing, those are the ports that will basically be opened up for that, and those are going to be 139, 445. A lot of times when you just see those, you would identify this as a Windows box. However, here it's saying that it's actually a Linux box. All right, so that's the .22. Okay, other things we can do. I'm going to stick with that same one here, and of course we can do all kinds of other things. We can do service versioning and things like that. So what we can do is we can now add things in something like SV, right, for service versioning, and we're trying to figure out what the versions are of the services that are running and things like that. So we can use different switches again like this that allows us to go in and check out some things. Remember, when we have some of these ports open, right, we can identify certain type of attacks. Right? Remember what SMTP is, your Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. And we can use it as a mail relay server, right? Things like that. Now, keep in mind, when you want to scan a network for potential targets, you're going to be using Nmap. Right? It's going to be pretty straightforward there, and so forth. If you wanted to find out what some of the, I'm going to run this here. If you want to find out what some of the different switches are and so forth that you can use in Nmap, feel free to look up the man pages for that and see what comes up with and such. And we'll see here what the results are coming back from this. So we should be getting some results back regarding the service version that's running. So we'll figure out what FTP is, what SSH it's running, and so forth. And a lot of times too, what you can do is run specific type of port numbers. So once this comes back, I'll show you what that looks like. And let me take this opportunity too to mention again, make sure you have an opportunity to check out some of the type and codes of your ICMP error messages and figure out which ones that can be used out there, because you may get a question or two on that as well. Now, some of the port numbers that I'm not seeing on here that you need to know about is Kerberos. And Kerberos is used for authenticating your username and password on a Windows domain environment. It runs off of port 88. All right, that's going to be important to remember. Port 88 is for Kerberos. Port 110 for POP3, right? 25 for SMTP, 2021 for FTP, things like that. 445 is basically SMB over TCP IP. We have 389, which is also found a lot on Windows environment, domain environments, because it's running LDAP, your Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, running at 389. Not to be confused with 3389, which is for remote desktop. Another big one might be NTP, your Network Time Protocol, and it runs simply off of port 123. 123 for NTP. All right, we should hopefully be getting some results back here in just a moment. Almost there. Okay, and there we go. And as you can see, we're getting a lot of information back. So we get the service that's running, obviously, and then the version of it, which is great because that tells us then what we can actually use against that particular target. If we know that there's a specific version, like on Pro FTPD 1.3.1, and we did a little research and found out that 1.3.1 has specific vulnerabilities that we can exploit because they didn't upgrade to 1.3.2, then we could use that, right? And of course, for that, we need to be able to identify different versions. That's why it's important to figure out the versions. You can also determine, too, by looking at some of these numbers, is if they've maybe updated to a latest service pack or latest patch and so forth, and things like that. So those are definitely some things you can check out and investigate a little further and so forth. So if I wanted to take the 2 scans I just did and maybe specify only a specific port, let's say we wanted to stick with port 21 here, the VSFTP D.2.3.4, what I could do is put in something like this, nmap -O for our operating system, right? And then we do a -SV, right? With service versioning, which we just did, and then we can do a -P where we can specify a specific port, in our case 21. We can also specify other port numbers by putting a comma in there, let's say 53. Let's say we wanted to also figure out port 514 maybe, something like that. Again, 514 for your syslog. And let's do 8180, just to be, just to try something out, 8180. All right, something like that. And then, of course, we give it the IP address, in this case, 192.168.40.22, something to that effect. And then we can actually see it. Now, it's only going to go out there and give us the results back from those 4 port numbers that we specified. However, it's going to do the same thing as we did before individually. It's going to give us the operating system version and service versioning along with that as well. And let's take a peek at what the output will look like just on those, and then we'll move on. Again, if you have the opportunity to try some things out, try them out using Nmap, your network mapper. It's a great little tool. It allows you to do a lot of cool things, and it's a pretty sweet deal. Again, anytime you're trying to get some reliable Nmap scans in, you want to do a connect scan, also known as a vanilla scan. And again, it's the TCP Connect scan. All right, it's also known as that. Very good. Okay, so as you can see here, we have the results. We have our specific port numbers, gave us those 4 ports that we looked at, and gave us some information, OS details, and all that good fun stuff, right? So really good stuff. Again, check it out. If you get an opportunity, check it out. All right, good stuff. Now we move on into the enumeration overview. Also, before we get to this, I wanted to mention real quick too is that on some of the other Nmap types related scenarios, just look at the output and make a logical choice on what the answer is. So if you're seeing something like output, like a open port equals this, closed port equals that. Let's say we do a fin with a no response for an open port and a fin with a reset acknowledgement for a closed port. You can almost take a really good guess on what the correct answer would be, right? And so forth. Same thing with some of your other types of scans. Just look at the scan, see what it's actually doing, and you should be able to actually go in and choose the correct answer by looking at the screenshot. Sometimes the answers will be right in there with the question itself. So keep that in mind as you're going out there and trying some of these things out. All right. One thing we haven't mentioned in the previous example was doing an idle scan. Now, when we do an idle scan, there's something very important that generally happens. Okay, so before we hop into the enumeration section, let's talk about a few more things here that I wanted to show you guys. So we also have, when we're looking at our command prompt and so forth, remember we talked about netstat and so forth, but let's say I use the ping command, we talked about ICMP a little bit. Actually, I'm going to do my loopback address of 127.0.0.1. As you can see here, we're getting a reply back, and the reply is indicating that it's alive and well, right? That it's replying back to ICMP echo requests. And interestingly enough, let me see what I can do here. I can manipulate the ping command a little bit and do something like ping -L65500, for instance. with 127.0.0.1 with a minus t. And you notice anything different here between the two currently? Well, one is it's a continual ping using the minus t option. Secondly, if you look over here, everything else is the same, the 127.1. The bytes, you notice here we have 32 bytes. We have 65,500 bytes here. The time here and the TTL are all the same. So the only difference is here is the allocated bytes that I'm sending over with my ICMP requests. Now back in the day, something like this was actually called the ping-a-death attack. And the whole purpose of this was to overwhelm the devices that it was going through or to basically cause some type of denial of service against it and so forth by overflowing what it could handle. Now this attack generally doesn't work anymore, so you won't be able to use it. However, you could use something like this to figure out what is allowable to that device. Because what happens is if you, let's say we did this on, let's say we, instead of 127.0.0.1, let's say we wanted to do something like, I don't know, let's try yahoo.com. And what you'll notice here, it's coming back with nothing, timed out, right? However, if I went in and I tried something like 1500 even, you'll notice we're still not getting any replies. So let's try something a little bit lower. How about 500? And you notice here we're actually getting 500 back. So that basically tells us that between 1,500 and 500 bytes is what's allowable on the yahoo.com site when we're actually pinging it. So what you could then do is actually go back and forth and just go up to 600, 700, and just figure out what is allowable to that server in this case, and so forth, and whatnot. So as you saw, though, when we tried it with the 65,500, it definitely came back with request timed out. So that would be basically saying we're doing a ping-a-death attack against Yahoo, right? Which is not something we want to do. But this is how you would basically go through and try some of these things out, right? On how to do that. Again, it's called a ping-a-death attack. Pretty straightforward when it's with its use and so forth, and it's pretty cool stuff. Now, other things you may want to take a peek into is the name of different types of attacks that occur. So when it comes to, let's say, doing a Smurf attack, so when you hear that term Smurf attack, what it's basically doing is it's an attack where we're sending ICMP packets across the network. Right, so we're getting flooded with ICMP packets. That's called the Smurf attack. We have another one called the Fraggle attack. And the Fraggle attack, basically, you're flooding the network with UDP packets. We also have what's called a SYN flood attack. And here, obviously, we're providing the network with SYN packets. We're flooding it with SYN packets. And then what happens is when you send out SYN packets, it will, of course, come back with the appropriate SYN acknowledgement packets. However, it will never complete that three-way handshake, right? And it won't even send a reset back. It just won't reply. And what happens is on the target, it ends up holding on to that SYN packet, right? The SYN acknowledgement, it is expecting a response back from the source, saying, hey, I've received your SYN acknowledgement. And it will hold it for roughly 75 seconds. So in a sense, you could, for instance, cause a denial of service attack using a SYN flood attack, and where you're basically overflowing the queue on the destination computer or your target computer by having it hold on to the SYN acknowledgement response, and you're waiting for that response, and with that you can fill up the queue and do things like that. Right, so those are some of the different types of things. Now we talked about the MAC flood attack, which the whole purpose of the MAC flood attack is to overwhelm the switch to act like a hub. Right, and that's the whole purpose of doing that. Now another thing that we could mention here in this section is called the idle scan. Nmap has an option that has called the idle scan. And the whole purpose here is to use another machine to do the actual attacks from. So in a sense, we're pivoting our attack from our machine to another to the destination as our target. And that pivoting computer we're using, that idle machine we're using, is called a zombie PC. Not a zombie PC like a botnet, but like a botnet, but more strictly for the idle scan section. And the whole purpose here is to relay information to our zombie that then forwards it on to the target. Now where things become important here is what's called the IP ID. And the IP ID information generally will indicate if, in our case, if a port is open or if it's closed. And we basically want to keep track of that as we go through. So you can imagine when we have a particular scenario where we want to find out if a port's open, obviously a port's going to respond, right, if it's open. So if we basically send an IP ID of a specific value through idle scanning, right, the computer on an open port will respond back to the zombie machine, which will then respond back to the hacker machine. That means the IP ID will actually increment by 2 if it's an open port. Okay, if it's a closed port, the IP ID will only respond back with an increment of 1. Big difference. Make sure you know the difference there. Okay, and that's where that kind of comes into play when it comes down to this thing called the idle scan and such. All right. Again, if you have the opportunity, try it out and see what comes up with in regards to some of your Nmap results and so forth. And try different things, see what you come up with, and know your port numbers, because obviously we want to know port numbers so that way you can determine what services are actually running and so forth on that. All right, and that's pretty much the gist of that. Now we'll talk about some other tools here in a little bit as well, called HPing, and you'll get an opportunity to see this again. We saw it in earlier practice demo stuff that I showed you guys. And what I would recommend there on the HPing side is that you also try it out, look at some of the options that we have available for HPing and some of the switches thereof, and use that. Now keep in mind that HPing will use TCP instead of ICMP by default, so make sure you understand the difference between HPing and Nmap. Okay, pretty straightforward overall once you figure out the differences there. All right, we'll try to lay it all out for you. So again, if I asked you guys yet now to identify let's say if I wanted to do an Nmap scan to a machine that is not pingable, meaning that it's not replying to ICMP requests, right, with a reply, and it's coming back request timed out, how can I still scan it? And here, we can use what's called the don't ping option. And this would be done by using the -PN or -P0 as our option, and that basically means don't ping before you scan for the ports. It's called the don't ping, and it's -PN or -P0, and that basically means don't ping it before you scan for port numbers, because Nmap by default will only scan for port numbers on those machines that actually reply back to a ping response and such. All right? So pretty cool. Again, try it out. Just give it a shot, see what you get. And other than that, you should be able to answer any kind of Nmap questions. Again, knowing some of the different flag numbers, as in the flags, knowing the different types of scans. Remember, we mentioned different scans. Now, some of them you'll be able to identify. We mentioned, for instance, the open, half-open scan, the connect scan. There was another one, too, called the Christmas scan or the Xmas scan. And the Xmas scan basically has it's referred to as the Xmas scan because it generally says it's using all of the available flags, right? However, it actually only uses the fin flag, the urge flag, and the push flag. And if you see anything with the fin urge push, that would be considered a Xmas or Christmas scan. All right, and everything else should be self-explanatory. If you see anything with a fin scan, you should know that it's a fin scan, right? If it's a null scan, for instance, it would have no flag set and things like that. But again, best way to find out some of those additional scenarios is to look up the manual pages for Nmap and look through that. At least take a good browse through and get yourself familiarized with the tool Nmap. All right, very good. Let's go ahead and hop on into the next section, which is going to be the enumeration side of things. So here we're going to be looking into the enumeration which is basically going to be the process of obtaining network resources, usernames and passwords, services, and machine names. Information can be gained by enumerating banners, also referred to as banner grabbing, from FTP servers, web servers, and email servers. Now, hopefully you've got this down already. FTP servers, which meaning port 21. Web servers, meaning port 80 or port 443. Email servers, port 25. Right? We have the fully qualified domain names and IP addresses. Right? We have IP configuration of routers and servers, information from Active Directory using LDAP, your Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which runs on port 389. All right, we can also get usernames and share names available too. So here we're going to be showing you methods and tools used to perform enumeration, as well as some of the countermeasures to protect against this as well. So here we have a particular web server banner that we can get through using Telnet. Now, we can do this via Telnet. We can do this also via a tool called Netcat. But here, let's stick with Telnet for a minute. And with Telnet, we basically put in the web server IP address or name, and then we put a space in there with a port number, in this case, port 80. Now, there's two methods you can go about doing this. One is you can type in the get space / HTTP / 1.0, or you can type in head space / HTTP / 1.0. Hit enter, enter, and you should then get some results as you see here on the big screen. So on this particular one, we have a Microsoft IIS 5.0 when we telneted into 10.11.201 at port 80. And then the results back, again, showing us 5.0 on the IIS. That's meaning it's a 2000 server. Now, I would also recommend that you know the differences between your 2000 server, your 2003 servers, your 2008 servers when it comes to IIS. IIS 5 is 2000. IIS 6 is 2003 server, and IIS 7 is going to be 2008 server. All right, and that's where that comes into play. All right, now there are tools out there that we can use to assist us with getting additional information from another web server, for instance. And we'll talk more about this too in the later modules when we talk about the web server and web applications. But here's a tool that's worth mentioning. It's called HTTPrint, and it basically allows us to figure out what actual versions are running on a machine, and as in on a web machine. As you can see here, we got some results back from 3 different websites and what's actually running, as in what the banner grabbing information actually is and so forth. It can be run on command line as well as the GUI interface, and basically is referred to as a fingerprinting tool, as in this case a web server fingerprinting tool. All right, now we can also do things like DNS enumeration. Now hopefully you remember that DNS runs off of port 53. So if we see port 53 out there, we can actually look at the NSLOOKUP tool, for instance. We can also use other tools that allows us to go in and actually try to do a zone transfer and so forth. Now, any DNS server that is accessible from the internet can be queried to tell the hacker about server names and IP addresses. If the DNS server contains records for not only the DMZ servers, as in your demilitarized servers, but also internal servers, this could be a security hole. If the hacker is able to determine internal machine names, the hacker can then also find out the machine's IP addresses and so forth as well. Now we can also, of course, get this through mail, emails, and so forth, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Our countermeasure here is to have separate internal and external DNS servers. And here we see NSLOOKUP. And I'm going to show you guys a demo on NSLOOKUP so you can see it happen in there as well. Important information about NSLOOKUP is how to look up information regarding your DNS records. We talked about the DNS records earlier. We want to be able to look up things such as your whatever MX record for your mail record, right? And we use the set type to determine that, as in what we're specifically looking for and so forth. Again, let's take a peek into this and see what you get. Okay, now we know a little bit more about NSLOOKUP and so forth. Again, the Unix version of that is called DIG and such. All right. Now, the next thing up is the SNMP insecurities, right? This is going to be your simple network management protocol. The port number, 161. That's used to remotely manage TCP IP services, and there are basically 2 security issues with version 1 and 2. It's basically the community strings are going to be sent in clear text. Remember we talked about this as well? The community strings by default, public or private, public for read-only, private for read-write access. Best way to get around this is to use version 3 because it provides encryption. So here the enumeration countermeasures, blocks 161 and 162 on your firewalls. Remember we said 161 was for SNMP and 162 was for SNMP trap. You can implement SNMP version 3, which encrypts data and provides strong authentication. Change the default community strings to something cryptic like a strong password. You want to configure SNMP agents to respond only to pre-programmed IP addresses, and then also disable, remove SNMP agent software if you're not using it at all. And also consider using IPsec to encrypt your SNMP traffic if you're still using version 1 or 2. Remember we talked about LDAP, your Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now it uses X500 naming scheme for objects in the directory. This naming scheme uses distinguished names to identify objects within the directory. So you can see here we have a listing. My recommendation here with Active Directory, LDAP specifically, which runs on port 389. And also there's a secure LDAP, which runs off of port 636. So LDAP 389, secure LDAP 636. And basically here, if you look at the format of how things are actually pointed out, so as you see we have the CN equals, OU equals, and DC equals, and so forth. That's going to be the format that you're going to see. So anytime you see anything like this, just know that it's LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now there are tools that you can actually use for Active Directory enumeration. Again here, using LDAP Miner. And anonymous queries will fail if LDAP null-based queries are disabled. And the usage would be something like ldapminer.exe with the -h for the host and then whatever options. Just keep in mind the default port number is 389 and then you have some other options there. Main thing here is just to know what tool that you can use to actually enumerate some Active Directory, in this case, using LDAP Miner. Countermeasures, block ports 389 for LDAP. You can also block ports 3268 for the global catalog and do this on your firewall servers, as in on your firewalls. Remove the Everyone group from the pre-Windows 2000 compatible access group. This pre-Windows 2000 group by default has read permission on all objects within the Active Directory database. Now if you need to protect against external employees, set the organizational unit permissions such that users in other organizational units cannot read, as in remove the authenticated user's read permission. This will then also limit the information they will retrieve. Null sessions, awesome stuff. Now with null sessions, pretty cool stuff. We basically have an anonymous connection that we are allowed to do, and we can retrieve certain information such as username, groups, shares, and services from that. Now null sessions take advantage of features within the server message block protocol that exists for trusted domains to enumerate resources, external computers to authenticate and enumerate users, and the system account to authenticate and enumerate resources. Generally, ports 139 and 445 on the TCP side is required to be open in order for a null session to be successful. It also needs to be able to connect to the IPC $ first. It's very straightforward to use, right, when it comes to null sessions. So it allows us to connect in. We have to have the correct usage, so keep in mind it's going to be net space use space / the IP address / IPC $ space double quotes space /u or user colon double quotes. And this basically allows us to log in as an anonymous user with a null password, basically. All right, and that's pretty much what it's going to look like. You need to know that. Now, obviously, here we see the net use, and using net view to see what's actually shared out and so forth with that. And again, once we have this established, as you saw, we can use other tools like dumpsec that will allow us to go in and then enumerate users and things like that. Now, which we'll talk about in the password section here when it comes to system hacking and stuff. When it comes to passwords, we'll mention things like the SID account, the security identifier, which is basically where we have the S number, and then at the very end we have the 500, which is always going to indicate our default administrator, but then we also have other numbers and so forth. But we'll talk more about that when we talk about password cracking and such, but at least we have a little forward on that. But anyhow, as you can see here, we're shown here in null session to 10.1.1.201 and a list of shares on that machine. And there's other tools we can use to retrieve information from the target machine, as we've seen in the demo using dumpsec, for instance. We can also use Cain enable to create a null session. And it's pretty straightforward when it comes to Cain enable and how to do that. We just double click it, as in we put in the name. We right click the quick list, put in the IP address. Once that comes up, we just double click and voila, it creates an anonymous connection. And this basically takes us back down to the review of everything we've just talked about. Now, we talked about a lot of information. And with this, we've also covered a lot of practice questions, or a lot of questions and such that we come across. So just to kind of recap, right, when it comes to the reconnaissance side of things, right, we're basically doing reconnaissance, which includes everything from social engineering, right? We have active and passive reconnaissance. We've mentioned perhaps dumpster diving, which is also part of reconnaissance because you're trying to grab information from the trash can and so forth, right? It's also part of social engineering type of scenario. Things like the different types of hackers and so forth that we talked about in the first module too. Some other things that we perhaps didn't mention, which I'll show you right now, which is very important. Actually, we may have seen this in the previous thing on Central Ops, but it's something called the robots text file. And the best thing for that is I'm going to show you guys a demo on this that will actually show you the robots text file. And it's going to be very important that you know what it is, what it does, and this demo will actually show you how to go about doing that. Let's see, other things that we talked about. We talked about Google, right, and the different types of things we can use. We talked about Tor and using an anonymizer and things like that, right? We talked about different ways we can actually gather information off of other machines using different types of scanning methods, such as doing OS fingerprinting, things of that nature. We talked about information such as getting Whois information. This is where we talked about the reconnaissance and what the attackers are actually gathering, and we're trying to figure out things like who registered the domain and when it expires and things like that. So that way we can actually send the administrator that signed up for that an email saying, hey, your domain name's about to expire, and you need to click on this link to renew it, kind of thing. In reality, that's actually then going to a different website, which then allows us to grab some data. Right, we talked about the 5 phases, right? The 5 hacking phases, right? Gaining access. We basically get into things like escalating privileges, executing applications, hiding files, and then covering our tracks and such. Now we also mentioned things like reconnaissance, scanning enumeration, right? Maintaining access, and then hiding files and so forth, and of course covering our tracks and things to that nature that we've kind of mentioned. At least we're mentioning here again on that. So, all right. So other things are things like we talked about banner grabbing, or looking at the operating system banners and how we can use that via Telnet to the port 80. Things like that. We've talked about different social engineering type scenarios. Again, you should be able to identify any social engineering type of attacks and so forth along with that. Other things is the protocols and the different scans and so forth that we looked into, right? We talked about the half-open scan. We talked about the connect scan. We talked about the fin scan, the null scan, the Xmas scan, things like that. We talked about the different flags that we associate, the three-way handshake, ICMP. This is where I ask you also to check out some of the ICMP reply codes and so forth, going to the protocols.com website and checking those and studying that. We talked about different port numbers that we've needed to know. Everything from port 445, which is SMB over TCP/IP, all the way down to port SSH, which is port 22 for SSH. We also have port 123, port 389 that we talked about, which is for NTP and LDAP that we just discovered. We also talked about some of the default stuff, such as IIS-6 for 2003 server. IIS-7 is basically a 2008 server. We mentioned idle scanning, things like that, right? The connect scan, all that good fun stuff. We were able to look into some of that. We saw HPing in action, and how we can utilize HPing for, in that demo case, a denial of service type scenario, and how we can use a SYN scan with it and such. We talked about SNMP, DNS, SMTP, and things like that. So again, knowing just those little pieces of information will definitely get you through a lot of different things. Now, I mentioned about ports 514, which is used for syslog, right? And so any kind of log messages and so forth are going to be running off of port 514. Now, other things is, as I mentioned, with the 9100, which is basically your JetDirect, that comes to play there, and such. Other than that, we are ready to move on into the next section, which is going to be system hacking. And here we'll talk about things like password cracking. We'll talk about things like ADS, your alternate data streams. We'll talk about how to hide our files, and how to erase them, things like that. How to clean up our tracks and the such. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop on into the next section to get some more things covered.